Okay, we're ready to get started. Thank you for joining us. I think there was a little bit of a shuffling of names that happened on the official program. Originally, I believe that it was something more like the role of neuroscience in the architectural experience. So we'll try and bridge those two ideas, especially because of Eduardo's talk on wayfinding. And so this panel is the role of neuroscience in the making of intelligent buildings and the role of neuroscience in architectural experience. We'll start with Eduardo Macagno, and his talk is entitled Finding Your Way in the Built Environment, followed by Philip Beasley, and I'd like to give him a formal introduction after Eduardo since he hasn't had one in the conference yet. And then lastly, we'll have Michael A.Arbib speak shortly about his ideas of neuromorphic architecture. And we'll go to that point. Thanks.
Yes, turn it on. Okay. So I am happy to be up here once more. Yesterday I tried to come up with some ideas about how to create a laboratory, which I call the evidence-based laboratory, where I was proposing that we could do some collaborative projects between neuroscientists and architects. And today I would like to give an illustration of kind of the things that I was talking about and give you a little motivation for why I think wayfinding is a particularly appropriate area for us to collaborate on. So my goal, and I'll just read the bottom, is a deeper knowledge of these responses that we can actually understand with respect to the built environment, can provide architects and facility designers with a basis for improving the built environments we live in. Okay, that's kind of what I'd like to make the goal of this talk. Now, as I said in the discussion yesterday, I'm not prescriptive, I'm just trying to enable. Okay? And I'm not an architect, I'm a neuroscientist, and most of my life I've worked with synapses. But lately I've been working with older humans, of which I'm one. So why should we study wayfinding? I think that it's beneficial to both of us. So as a neuroscientist, I think that I would like to understand how neural maps and navigation decisions are made. I would like to know what happens when our ability breaks down, and that happens normally in normal aging and becomes catastrophic when you have Alzheimer's. And as a test to see if this approach is valuable or not, I think we have to know whether if we do experiments in a virtual environment, whether they relate directly in some way to the real environment. With respect to design, I think that it's important to know what are effective cues, things that we respond to, that we're asked to respond to, but we have to know whether we respond. Where should cues that allow us to wayfind well should be located, what scale, what surroundings, what contexts are effective, and then how do we get people to pay attention, basically. So what is wayfinding? And as far as I could find out, it was a word that was coined by Lynch in a book called The Image of the City. And basically what he said is the use of wayfinding is the use of elements of the built environment to navigate in complex spaces from one specified location to another. And as he points out, wayfinding requires orientation to know where it is that you're going. You have to make route decisions as you try to go to the place you want to get to. You know, much of the time, not everybody, but most people make mental maps of how they're going to get from A to B. And then something people don't often talk about is how do you know when you got there? Now, it could be obvious, you know, if I want to go to, you know, the Palazzo Vecchio and I'm somewhere in a little street in Florence, what I want to do is to get to some open space where I can see the tower, right? And then I can plan around that. But I know that that's where I'm going. And a problem that people have, particularly people with dementia, is they may not recognize where it is that they're going. So anyway, so these are components that we need to worry about. So you know, if you go on Google and you put in wayfinding, you're going to find that there are many, many companies which are concerned with wayfinding. This one is FD2S, and what it says on the top is, we enhance experiences through wayfinding, branding, and design. But wayfinding is the operating principle here. So architects, of course, are very concerned with, and urban designers are concerned with how do you get from A to B in the urban environment or in the outdoors. Whoops. They're also very concerned with wayfinding in interior. And so, because we are happy to be creative and do things in our very own ways, you can go to any building in town and you're going to find that there's a somewhat different way of signing you how to get from A to B. And so here's a couple of examples, some of which are very creative but very difficult to use. And I want to particularly point out the one on the left here, which I was trying to to figure out how, if I'm the driver, I'm going to actually understand what these signs are, which are going to be under my car. But, you know, it's actually very creative. And then on the right side, I just put an illustration of a hallway that I would call ambiguous. It's very hard to tell exactly what's going on. So the challenge is, I think, in trying to understand how we do find our way and how we get lost, is how do we test whether any of those signs and any of those designs whether they're successful in guiding people in built spaces to where they want to go, or how do we test, and I would say this is something that we can approach, which signs, shapes, colors, landmarks, cues, etc., are successful for the many different individuals that are the users of any of these structures. And I would venture to say that in many, if not most of our structures, we expect young people to find their way, and we expect old people to find their way. But we build those structures for neither of those. We build them for you guys who are good gamers and so on. But for older people, it can become a real challenge. So if you look under why people get lost in buildings, there is a very interesting article by Susan Carlson and collaborators, 2010, in which they analyze and they propose some ideas about why is it that people get lost in buildings. Okay, so there are 3 factors they propose that may be difficult. One is that the spatial structure of the building, that is the layout of the stairs, elevators, atria, open spaces, floors, and so on, may not be conducive for your average person to figure out where to go, particularly if you go from one floor to another and things change radically from one floor to another. or if there is no way of knowing which direction is the direction you want to go in, and you end up exploring because you don't know what direction. The second aspect, it has to do with our human capabilities, and that is that we make cognitive maps. We assess the situation. We create, using this structure that we heard about earlier called the hippocampus, we create maps, or otherwise known as spatial memory maps. And if our ability to make a map is not somehow congruent with the layout that is offered in the building, maybe it's just not going to work. And lastly, we use somewhat different strategies to navigate, and I want to spend a little time talking about that. But coming back to an example that we saw a little earlier, Susan Carlson and her coworkers discussed the problems with this structure, which you've seen before. Okay, this is, I've never been there, okay, but it is considered to be a terrific architecture. It is a library. And as someone referred to in a previous talk, I think Harry was, it's not conducive to do what you do in a library, which is to read books. But it's particularly also non-conducive to find where the book is that you want to read. And so there's been a lot of analysis actually as to what that might be, what the reason might be. And various people have come up with different ideas, but one of them is that the layout of the building is very complex. It's not the same as you go from one floor to another, so you create a map in one floor and it doesn't work in the next floor. And in particular, something that people complain about are these escalators which skip floors. And so you get on an escalator thinking you're going to the next floor, but you end up 2 or 3 floors above, and then there are no escalators going down. So, you know, it's not conducive to ease of movement. And it's not easy even for, you know, your average person, and it's very hard for older people in particular. Okay, so here's one of these escalators. You take the escalator and you're going to someplace, not clear, right? Now you can look at a pillar which explains things and you try to make a cognitive map, but essentially you're going through a hole. No visual cues and so on. So what Carlson and her co-workers come up with is a way of thinking about whether something will work or not, and that is to take into account this. You've seen this 3-circle congruency before, used for many different things, but in this case, they point out the 3 elements that I mentioned at the beginning: the layout of the building, the cognitive maps that we're able to make, and what strategies we use. And in some way, all of these 3 have to work together in order to create or to be able to navigate in a complex environment. So this is a little cartoon that came out recently in the New Yorker. I'll read it for you. You're going to take a left at the nondescript white wall, keep going till you pass a nondescript white wall, then head right when you hit a nondescript white wall. If you see a nondescript white wall, you've gone too far. Sometimes you want to get lost. I was talking to Michael before, and he said, when I'm in Venice, I'd like to get lost. And of course, so do I, and probably most of you, because you can get out of there. You're lost voluntarily, right? What if you were lost but just cannot get out? Your anxiety levels go up and so on and so forth. So it is the ability to find your way in space is inherently connected to your ability to consider a space, a place. Right? What we're doing all the time when we look at space, we analyze it and so on, and then we create spaces that we can identify. And that's, in part, what allows us to navigate. So how do we navigate? Well, this is a kind of a simplified version of the kinds of things we do. We look for landmarks. We follow paths that we've been told, go 3 blocks forward and then take a left 2 blocks, but it's a path. And you can learn that. And harping back or pointing back to something Michael was talking about, after some time, it becomes what is called procedural memory. So most of you, when you first came to Pratt, had to figure out how to get here. And now you probably get out of bed and run to get to class, and you don't think about it. I mean, you get here and you say, oh, I'm here. You've created a path that is procedural. You don't have to rehearse it all the time. And then we create maps, okay? And if you live in California, those are oftentimes freeways, particularly if you live in LA, because you have to know which freeway to get on, because once you get into one of them, you may end up 50 miles down the road before you can actually come back. So you create a map, and you see yourself in the map. So there are a couple of strategies that people have been studying with respect to how our brain constructs or defines a path. One of them is called allocentric. It's a strategy. And in that case, what we do is we create a map in which the relationships of places, objects, landmarks, and so on, is with respect to each other, and then we imagine ourselves on that map and see what we have to do. And if you live in a difficult layout, like southern Manhattan, you have to do that. If you live, as I did for many years, in the Upper West Side, you know that it's a grid and it's very simple, and you see where the river is, and you know that that's west, and that's a very simple map. Okay, but we need to, in that case, to have an idea of what the layout and the relationships are. Another general strategy is called egocentric, and in that case, basically what we look for are things that we recognize and relate them to us. I am here at this corner, I recognize the corner, and then I have to get to that corner and look, and maybe I'll recognize something else, and I'll go that way. It's always related to yourself. Now, why do I go into these details? I want to show you a couple of recent results of people working on this aspect of human endeavors, wayfinding. So Veronique Bobot and her group in McGill up in Canada have been studying strategies that we use for navigation. And they use actually a lot of the work that is done from the point of view of either cognitive psychology or neuroscience and so on, is actually done in virtual environments because it's easier to do it. If you have to have a lot of people going around Manhattan, and there are studies like that, usually you do a study with 10, 20 people and so on. But with a virtual reality environment, you can actually test a lot of people in a relatively safe environment. So in this case, what they had was a very common strategy that we use, and that's to create a maze where you have to practice how to get to a particular place, and what we test is how well do you make a map. Okay, so in this case, you have to find a particular arm of the maze where there's going to be an object, and you learn how to do that, and then you practice it. And so they tested people, a whole group of humans from 8 years old to 80 years old, and they got the results that you see on the right. So basically, what the light bar says is that relates to what I was calling allocentric strategies. And for younger people, teens and so on, they tend to use allocentric strategies, that is mapping, a lot more than they use procedural memory or path, finding a path. But as a function of age, by middle life, young adults, as they have here, you're using both of them all the time. And the interesting thing is that as you get older, the older you get, the less you're able to make maps. And so you tend to have to use paths, learning a path, a procedural, you have to learn from the procedure how to get, where you want to go. Now, of course, you could say, who cares? After all, you have GPS. All you have to do is just punch the address and look at it. And the problem is that a lot of people don't have the ability to follow a GPS any more than they have to create a map. But be that as it may, it certainly has improved the ability to get places as a driver, for example, to have someone tell you, turn right, turn left, and so on. In any case, but this is the reason I'm using this as an illustration is to motivate why, if we're interested in buildings that are not difficult to navigate, not only do we have to think about how to structure it and where to put the cues and landmarks and so on, but we have to keep in mind that the strategies that the users are going to use will depend on what age they are. And these are all considered normal human beings. Okay, and if you were to do this, and people have, if you were to do this at age 80 for 80-year-old, in a cross-section, you'd find that most people that have some degree of cognitive impairment are absolutely unable to make maps. And the question that I want to address next is why. Okay, so here's a cartoon, and it points out 3 parts of the brain. One of them is one that Michael mentioned earlier. Whoops, sorry. It's right here, the hippocampus. And I want to point out another structure which is up here called the caudate nucleus. These are all deep inside your head. And then there's another place that we heard about. It's supposedly the seat of emotions, or at least contextualizing memories with emotional content. And that is the amygdala. But I'm not going to go into that. So what's interesting about this is that the hippocampus is a structure that deteriorates in human beings. It's the first thing to start shrinking for most of us. Okay, so the reason that we cannot make maps or are impaired in making maps as we get older is that we're losing mass right here. And if you happen to be going towards mild cognitive impairment, early Alzheimer's, this structure is gone. It disappears. And you get basically what Michael was saying about this patient that had, because of epilepsy, had the hippocampus removed. You get an inability to create spatial memory. Now, the reason I point out the other part of the brain here is that that part of the brain has been implicated a lot on what is called procedural memory. So procedural memory, as I said, is something you practice and you get to know, right? Riding your bicycle, once you've ridden it a couple of times, you don't think about it. You don't plan it. The motor cortex has the program, and you just do it. Okay, so that happens to go through, as I said, this structure more, in fact, it doesn't go through a hippocampus at all. And so it turns out that someone like the patient that Michael was talking about, who could not make new maps and new memories, could not go out of where he was living without getting lost. But when he was taken back to the original place where he was born before the surgery occurred, he could find his way just about anywhere because he had a memory trace, even though he did not have anymore the capacity to generate new memories. So an interesting thing about this is that, as I said, in Alzheimer's and other principally in Alzheimer's, this structure is impaired much, much later than this. And so if we learn how to tap into that structure, maybe we can help people with early Alzheimer's who are unable to find their way because maybe we can facilitate procedural memory. Now, I have some ideas how I would do it, but maybe you as designers and architects could think about how can you create environments that facilitate that learning process. And let me tell you a little bit more. How am I doing in time? I'm going to take 5 minutes? Well, I won't tell you about the hippocampus then. Let me just say that, well, let me talk a little bit, but I will skip telling you much about the hippocampus. So we now have some understanding of how human beings navigate because a number of people have actually been studying the structures of the hippocampus and associated structures, entorhinal cortex, a part of the hippocampus called the subiculum, and so on. And in rats, we know from recording from single cells that there are some cells, illustrated here, that respond when you are when the rat is in a particular place where they're, in the arena in which they're being tested. There are also cells which are directional cells, which respond when the rat is moving in a particular direction or turns its head. And there are other cells that are responsive. It's a very peculiar response, which is illustrated in my next slide, which are called grid cells. And the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine was given to, this past year, to O'Keefe, who found these place cells, and to the Mosers, who found the grid cells. Okay, I just want to tell you about this panel. So here is an arena, and a rat gets put in there, and we're recording from a single cell in the hippocampus. So you put it in there, let it run around, take it out, bring it back. By the third trial, that cell is already responding when the rat is in a particular place. By the fifth trial, it is very well encoded. Now you take the rat, and for several days, you take it to its cage, and it doesn't see this arena. The first trial, when you put it back, that cell remembers that place, and that's why they're called place cells. And they even remember that place in the dark, so they've created the map, but now they can use a lot of other cues to figure out where they are. We're thought to do the same thing, and we have similar kinds of cells. Just very briefly, the grid cells don't respond to one location like these two examples. They respond to a pattern of orthogonal coordinates, and they respond at the vertices. How they do that, we don't understand, but we think that it is the cells that create these grid patterns that, and in the entorhinal cortex, that give rise to place cells that identify a particular location. And there are other types of cells. I just want to show you one more type. Very interesting cells. So in this case, the experiment was, again, virtual environment, and the test is to find, starting from anywhere in this square, the middle is blocked, find a particular store. And in this case, these are recordings from humans, which are done while they're having surgery for epilepsy. And it turns out that in a particular part of the brain, there are cells that respond when people go clockwise, do not respond when they go counterclockwise. And other cells that respond better when you're going counterclockwise than when you're going clockwise. So the calculation for creating, a wave-finding procedure is complicated. We don't fully understand it, but because we are beginning to understand the elements that go into it, then we can think of designing the building to take into account what may be going in the brain and try to facilitate whatever is going on. And as I said, we don't completely understand it. We don't know exactly how it's done, but it's getting better. And that's what some people call our internal GPS. So I want to give you one more example before I go to what we're doing about wayfinding. So here's a set of experiments that are done with, again, with a virtual environment. This is a track, so the person is actually able to walk. And the task is, here is a picture of what the person sees at ground level, but this is a map. It's a zoo, and each node has a different animal. And what the people are asked to do is they're shown an animal, and they're supposed to find where that animal is. Okay? And what is measured is what kind of a path. Do you get better at it? Do you take less time? Do you go more directly? And so on. And the results of that are really, I think, quite amazing, and it's in the title. Okay? So this was done, again, with younger and older people. And it turns out, and I won't go into the details, I'm happy to send you the reference if you want. The result is that older people who do this exercise of learning to navigate this somewhat complex task preserve their hippocampus. And this is only for 4 months. We can actually see a difference after 4 months. The control group are people on the treadmill who are doing the exercise. So exercise, we all know, is good for your brain, and it's actually a preservative, if you want to use that word. Okay, it helps. But what people didn't know before this is that it's even more helpful for the hippocampus, which is not only how we make maps, but it's also how we consolidate memory. So anything we can do that is specific for the hippocampus is something we ought to be doing, okay, even if you're younger. Anyway, so that's kind of putting you where we are thinking and why we're thinking about the set of experiments that I want to tell you about a bit. So let's suppose that we are talking to each other, neuroscientist to architect. If we're going to do an experiment, the first thing we have to do is decide what we're going to do, right? What are we going to test? So one thing we might want to know is, how do you identify something as a navigational cue? It could just be incidental. It could be that it's there for whatever other reasons. Is it a cue? And then what we want to understand is, how is that defined? Do we have to always specify it? Are there certain features that make it a landmark? What is the context for that cue? And then, and I think that's more important and something we can study, is what makes a particular cue effective. You know, the worst thing about going into a hospital and being given a little map and told, there's the clinic, you have to start that way. As soon as you go past one of these cues, you're lost forever. You don't know how to go back. right? And at that point, you're asking a lot of people, so you're wasting a lot of people's time. But who goes to a hospital? Sick people go to a hospital. And so they're putting their germs everywhere, right? So you don't want people to get lost. You want those landmarks to be very clear and very obvious. So I showed you this slide, and I said I was going to talk about this. So what we've been doing is trying to come up with ways to understand what we do in order to navigate through buildings. And what I'm illustrating here is an early test where we started by asking the question, if you're navigating in virtual reality through a building for which I have the model, and you're navigating the building in the real building, is there a difference? Are you using different parts of your brain? And what can we say about it? And we're not the first to do this. There are lots of studies that actually suggest that you can get the same kind of information in virtual environments. It is not, of course, totally real, okay? And I think for certain subjects that we want to study, which means, in my case, early Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment, you can't take people to real environments. They're not safe. They're difficult. It's hard to get the insurance to pay for anything happening to them. But if we have a controlled environment, then we can actually do the experiments. So let me show you a little clip. 5 minutes. So this is the entrance actually to Cal IT Square, where we do these kinds of experiments. And I just want you to experience what you would be doing if you're in the virtual environment. An advantage of a virtual environment is you can go through walls without getting hurt, but we could have the doors open, it just takes more computer time. So here is that same hallway, but in the virtual environment, we've colored the doors. Turns out that it's a lot easier if the doors are colored to figure out where you are. And now we go to another part, and we said to the guy, okay, find the auditorium. So he did that in real, and now here's the virtual image. He's found the auditorium. And then the test that was, I think, the most telling is we had the subject go to what we call an ambiguous hallway. Okay, it's ambiguous because there are very few signs. We said, go find the auditorium, but now from the ambiguous side versus the unambiguous side where you have a lot of signs. Anyway, the result was basically that we can actually tell ambiguity and disambiguity. Now, what's an experiment we could do? You're designing a place, you want to know what you should put. And I'm not prescriptive, I'm just saying this is a possibility, right? What do you put in the hallway that would be helpful for people who are trying to navigate? And public facilities like hospitals, or heaven forbid you have to go to a government building or something like that, it's important that you be able to effectively get to where you want to go. So what can we do? We can measure a lot of different things. In particular, in my interest, as I said, is people that are becoming cognitively impaired and early Alzheimer's. And so what we're trying to develop are ways in which we might be able to help and help people create a sense of place, and perhaps develop some techniques for encouraging procedural memory. Now, one of the things that is worse for an Alzheimer's or other dementias patient is when they move from their home to a nursing home, they're completely lost. There's no map left. And this leads to their feeling lost all of the time. They don't know where their room is, and it's very hard for them to learn it because the hippocampus is not working. So maybe we can go through the caudate, and maybe we can use some of these techniques for doing that. So I just want to end by showing you a couple of slides of what we're doing now. Using simpler caves, I showed you a very large, very expensive cave. Now we're designing caves that are relatively inexpensive, much cheaper than most medical equipment. And here is a room in which we can put any kind of colors on the walls, or we can put objects on the walls, we can put a chair somewhere, we can put shelves, we can do all sorts of things. And then the task for the person is to find which tile turns green, and then to repeat it. And then we see how well they learn. And then we remove some of the landmarks, and we see how well they do that. Okay, and eventually we put them in a room with only one object, and most older people get lost. They have a very difficult time learning because you need to have orientation, not just saying, okay, I will go to the yellow wall and then go along the yellow wall and take 2 steps. Okay, if there's one object, then you need to know what your direction is, and that gets pretty hard to do. So that's one of the structures we're using. This is an even simpler one. And this one we're putting actually in an Alzheimer's clinic so that they can test people. Again, this is a simple room, colored walls, objects. What we want to know is what information is being used or not paid attention to. Okay, I think that's, I had a few things to say, but I think I'm just going to end here. So, I don't know if you can read this. At the bottom here, it says, if only I had a brain. So we have all of these ways of accessing aspects of cognition. And we think that this is a way in which, with our interest in neuroscience of what is going on in the brain, and the interest in the designer of making spaces which are efficient for different types of people, older, younger, and so on, that it's a good interface for us to think about some collaborations. Thank you.